The first sign that something was wrong in Milford came quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to notice. It began with the disappearance of a drifter who had been passing through town, a man few people really knew. He was last seen at a gas station on the outskirts, asking for directions, and then he simply vanished. Because he wasn't from Milford, his absence barely raised a whisper, but soon after, the pattern began to grow darker. Within weeks, a shopkeeper who had run a small corner store for over 2 decades failed to open his doors one morning. His car was parked outside, his lights were still on, and his cash register untouched. The people of Milford were unsettled, but they told themselves there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps he had gone away suddenly or fallen ill. Then the fear took root when a local teenager never returned home from school. Her backpack was discovered near a park bench, her books scattered across the ground as though dropped in a hurry. That was when people began to panic. Parents warned their children not to walk alone. Neighbors stayed indoors after dark, and for the first time in decades, Milford's streets felt unsafe. The once friendly town where everyone knew one another suddenly carried an air of suspicion. People looked over their shoulders and whispered about what could be happening. The police launched a full investigation, combing through forests, rivers, and abandoned buildings. But every search ended the same way, with nothing. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no blood. It was as if the missing had been plucked out of the world without leaving a trace. Investigators interviewed friends, families, and even strangers, yet no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The lack of answers only deepened the unease, leaving residents to wonder if someone among them was responsible. Rumors began to spread faster than the truth. Some claimed a predator was lurking in the woods. Others whispered about an underground group that had been hiding in Milford for years. People started connecting events that had never seemed suspicious before: strange gatherings late at night, flickering candlelight seen through forest trees, unfamiliar faces appearing and disappearing at the edge of town. Though most dismissed these tales as paranoia, they planted seeds of doubt in even the most rational minds. Fear gripped Milford in subtle but powerful ways. The town's once bustling streets emptied at night, and church pews filled with anxious families praying for safety. Shopkeepers closed earlier than usual, and schools held emergency meetings to assure parents that children would be protected. Yet despite all the precautions, the disappearances didn't stop. Another man was gone the following month, leaving his truck abandoned by the roadside with the keys still in the ignition. His family insisted he was a careful, responsible man who would never walk away from his life. The police grew more desperate, but they had nothing concrete to hold on to. By the time autumn arrived, Milford was no longer the peaceful community it once was. Fear had become part of daily life, and the idea that something sinister was happening was no longer just a rumor. It was an accepted reality. The missing were not returning, and the town could no longer ignore the possibility that an unseen force was choosing its victims, watching quietly, and waiting for the next to vanish. The farmhouse at the edge of Milford had always stood apart, hidden by thick trees and overgrown brush that few dared to wander through. To most, it was just an old structure left to rot, a relic of another time. But when investigators followed faint traces of evidence into the woods, they discovered it was far from abandoned. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and broken windows gave the place a haunted look. Inside, however, there were signs of recent use. Dust was disturbed on the floor, faint footprints trailed across the warped wood, and half-burned candles were scattered in every room. On the walls, strange markings had been painted in black and red, shapes and symbols no one in the investigative team could immediately recognize. Some resembled circles with intersecting lines, while others looked like crude drawings of eyes, flames, and figures kneeling in worship. The deeper they searched, the stranger it became. A large dining table in the main room was covered with wax drippings, melted down into hardened pools that suggested hours of ritual use. In one corner, they found a small pile of personal belongings: a bracelet, a torn shoe, a child's scarf. None of it made sense at first, but each item would later be linked to someone who had disappeared. The discovery confirmed what many in Milford had begun to whisper. Something organized, something dangerous, was happening here. Investigators uncovered notebooks hidden beneath loose floorboards, their pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic writings. Some names matched those of missing people, marked with strange symbols beside them. Others were names of locals still alive, leaving police unsure whether these individuals were future targets. What made it even more disturbing was the tone of the writings. They spoke of cleansing sins, offering sacrifices, and preparing for a world reborn in fire and purity. Whoever had written them believed with absolute conviction in what they were doing. The farmhouse wasn't simply a shelter. It was a gathering place, a meeting ground for a group that called themselves the Circle of Atonement. Their teachings were twisted, built on the idea that blood had the power to cleanse and renew. They saw themselves as judges and redeemers, convinced they were chosen to rid the world of what they called impurity. What outsiders saw as murder, they saw as a holy act. This revelation turned the investigation from a missing persons case into something far darker. Neighbors began coming forward, admitting they had occasionally seen figures moving through the woods late at night, carrying lanterns or torches. Some even recalled faint chanting on the wind, though they had dismissed it as imagination. No one had dared to report it before, partly out of fear, partly because they couldn't believe something so sinister could exist in their quiet town. Now those sightings took on a chilling new meaning. The farmhouse was searched top to bottom, but the group was nowhere to be found. It was clear they were clever, careful, and skilled at hiding. The evidence left behind was deliberate yet incomplete, as if mocking the investigators, daring them to uncover more. What began as an ordinary police search had now revealed the existence of a hidden community, operating in the shadows, bound together by secrecy and a willingness to kill in the name of belief. The question was no longer whether the missing were victims of random crime, but how many more lives would be taken before the Circle of Atonement was stopped. The investigation into the Circle of Atonement revealed details that seemed almost too horrifying to believe. What began with strange symbols and abandoned belongings soon unfolded into a clear picture of how the cult operated. Their practices were not chaotic or random. Every ritual followed a structure, carefully planned and rehearsed. Members of the group dressed in black robes stitched with red thread, hoods covering their faces so that each person became faceless, equal in their devotion. At the center of these gatherings stood their leader, a man once respected as a preacher, who had twisted the language of faith into something monstrous. He promised his followers salvation, not in the afterlife, but here on earth, through the cleansing power of blood. The cult's gatherings took place deep in the woods or within the decaying walls of the farmhouse. A circle of fire marked the ritual space, with candles placed at precise points to align with their symbols. The missing people were not chosen randomly. Each was carefully selected, often based on accusations whispered within the group. The leader convinced them that outsiders, and sometimes even townsfolk, were corrupt, poisoned by greed, lust, or dishonesty. By sacrificing them, the cult believed they were purifying the world, one soul at a time. To them, the rituals were sacred offerings that would ensure eternal life and protect them from the sins of the outside world. Investigators found chilling evidence of these ceremonies. Charred remains of robes and masks were buried in shallow pits, alongside tools stained with blood. Journal entries described how members prepared themselves by fasting, chanting for hours, and surrendering completely to the will of their leader. One passage told of a ritual where a victim was forced to kneel within a ring of fire, while the cult chanted words of judgment. The leader raised a ceremonial blade, declaring the victim's sins before striking. The act was not seen as murder among the group, but as an offering to a higher power they believed would cleanse them all. What made the discoveries even more disturbing was how normal the members appeared outside their secret world. Some were teachers, farmers, and small business owners, blending seamlessly into Milford's daily life. They attended church services, bought groceries, and spoke kindly to their neighbors. No one suspected that behind closed doors they were part of something so cruel and calculated. The dual lives they led allowed them to evade suspicion, and their silence was unbreakable. Loyalty to the Circle of Atonement came before family, friends, and even survival. For the police, the most shocking realization was how the leader maintained control. He used fear and promises of redemption, warning that anyone who left the cult would suffer eternal damnation or worse, become the next sacrifice. Members obeyed him with unwavering devotion, even when his demands grew more violent. It became clear that the disappearances in Milford were not isolated tragedies, but pieces of a larger, carefully crafted plan. Each ritual was another step in the cult's vision of a purified world, and the leader was willing to sacrifice as many lives as it took to achieve it. The case seemed to have reached a standstill until something happened that no one had expected. The Circle of Atonement, once so tightly bound by secrecy, began to fracture from within. Among the members was one who could no longer bear the weight of what they had seen and done. This individual had entered the group with the same promises of salvation that had drawn in so many others, but the endless blood and the growing violence began to gnaw at them. Fear became stronger than faith, and the realization that the leader's words were nothing more than manipulation pushed them toward betrayal. The break came quietly. Through anonymous notes slipped to investigators, the insider revealed locations, times of gatherings, and even the existence of a hidden chamber beneath the farmhouse. The police had always suspected there was more to the property than what they could see, but without a lead they had been unable to find it. Now, with precise instructions, they uncovered a trapdoor hidden beneath rotting boards in what looked like an unused cellar. The narrow passage led to a space that chilled even the most experienced officers. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a dozen people, but the walls told a story of horror. Symbols were etched into the stone, not painted but carved with obsessive care. Piles of wax, bones, and scraps of fabric littered the corners, and in the center of the room lay a crude altar stained dark with blood. Surrounding it were objects that investigators recognized from reports of missing persons: a pair of glasses, a rusted keychain, a child's hair ribbon. Each item confirmed that this was where the victims had been brought, where the rituals had reached their most terrifying moments. The betrayal did not stop there. The insider also provided details about how the cult operated in secrecy. Members communicated using coded phrases during everyday interactions, blending their plans seamlessly into normal conversation. Meetings were disguised as church study groups or community gatherings, making them nearly impossible to detect. Every step had been designed to deflect suspicion, but the insider's information pulled back the curtain on their carefully built facade. When the police planned their raid, tension ran high. Armed teams surrounded the farmhouse at night, moving silently through the woods until they closed in. Inside, they found members of the cult preparing for another gathering. Candles burned low and chants echoed in the air, but this time the ritual never reached its end. The arrests were swift, the chaos overwhelming as members screamed prayers and curses while being dragged away. The leader was captured along with many of his most loyal followers, but some managed to escape into the night, vanishing into the same shadows they had always used as cover. The betrayal from within shattered the myth of the Circle's invincibility. For the first time, Milford saw that the cult could bleed, that their secrets could be exposed, and that their leader was not untouchable. Yet even with arrests made and evidence seized, a chilling question lingered. How many had escaped justice, and how far were they willing to go to rebuild what had been destroyed? The fall of the Circle of Atonement marked one of the darkest chapters in Milford's history. When the arrests were announced, the town reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For months, fear had consumed every street, and now the names of neighbors, co-workers, and familiar faces appeared on the list of those accused. People who had once been trusted pillars of the community were revealed as willing participants in a web of violence and secrecy. The revelation tore families apart, as loved ones struggled to accept that those closest to them had been part of a murderous cult. The trials that followed drew national attention. In the courtroom, prosecutors presented the evidence gathered from the farmhouse and the hidden chamber beneath it. Photographs of the altar, the blood-stained tools, and the belongings of victims painted a picture too horrifying to deny. The insider's testimony became the backbone of the case, describing in chilling detail how rituals were carried out and how the leader manipulated his followers into obedience. Jurors sat in stunned silence as the story unfolded, the weight of each revelation sinking into the room. The leader remained unshaken through it all. He spoke little, his gaze cold, and when he did address the court, it was not with remorse, but with proclamations of prophecy. He claimed his work was unfinished and that the Circle's mission would continue beyond prison walls. His words unsettled many, but they only strengthened the resolve of those determined to see him locked away forever. In the end, he received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again walk free. Several cult members faced similar fates, sentenced to decades behind bars for their roles in the killings. Others, broken by the weight of their choices, cooperated with authorities and were given reduced sentences. A handful of individuals, however, remained silent, refusing to confess or deny their crimes. Their silence carried a menace of its own, as though they still clung to the belief that their leader would one day return to them. Despite the arrests, unease lingered in Milford. Not all of the cult members had been captured during the raid. Some had disappeared into the night, escaping into forests, highways, and cities beyond. Authorities issued warnings, urging vigilance, but the uncertainty left the town restless. Every strange noise in the woods, every unfamiliar face passing through, sparked whispers that the circle was still out there, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The farmhouse was eventually demolished, reduced to rubble in an effort to erase the stain it had left on the land. Yet even without the physical structure, the memory of what had happened there refused to fade. Locals spoke of hearing faint chanting in the distance when the wind howled through the trees, or seeing flickers of light deep in the forest where no one should be. Some dismissed these as imagination fueled by fear, but others swore that the past still lived in the shadows. Years later, the story of the Circle of Atonement remained a cautionary tale. It reminded the people of Milford how easily trust could be twisted, how belief could be turned into obsession, and how darkness could thrive in plain sight. The cult's legacy was not just the lives it had taken, but the scars it left on an entire community, scars that would never fully heal. In the end, Milford learned that evil does not always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it grows quietly within those you thought you knew best, spreading until betrayal and blood become inseparable.